Thank you, everybody. Courtney, I think you saw this talk a couple of weeks ago, so I apologize. Not much has
I'm
changed.
expecting that there's some new activity in.
I'll try to have a different flow, I guess, or something. We'll see what
If I
happens.
can recite, I'll just walk out.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. I'm Damon Cook, as Eileen shared. I'm with WP Engine. I'm a developer advocate, and I've recently been focusing much of my effort on contribution, giving back through code contribution and a variety of other make teams, but lately code. So hopefully this is all built in the block editor, and hopefully I got my font sizing okay. I hope it's not too small. I tried to make it large enough, but there may be a few cramped slides, so we'll see how it goes. But colorfultones.com presentation, Power of Activity API is where this can be found. And I'm curious, before I get started, how many folks have tried to build a block? Okay, wow, it's a lot more than the last time. That's good. Has anybody tried to play with the Interactivity API or explore it or read about it or? All right. Oh, okay, fun.
Yeah,
All right.
well, I've read about it. I haven't used it.
Okay. Well, hopefully, yeah, you'll learn a lot today then. And yeah, I leaned into a lot of kind of the existing documentation that's out there because the contributors have done a really great job of just like documenting how it's built and everything. So you'll see me use this acronym. I just wanted to clarify, it's kind of, I am not a big fan of acronyms, but they do save time and space in certain different, contexts. So what do we mean by interactivity when it comes to the web? I mean, you can get pretty broad and say any input field or any, anything you can tab through or click on is interaction, right? But it's a little different when it comes to the Interactivity API in WordPress. There are a few examples that exist in the code base today. The first one here is the image light box. So there's a toggle that allows you, when you add an image block in the current version of WordPress, you can enable a light box so it expands when the user clicks it. That's an optional interactivity API option. And then over here on the right, I have an example of the query loop block, which uses pagination. So again, you can opt into, so you don't have a full page refresh, and so it's just kind of a consistent, seamless experience when you paginate through the query loop. Those are kind of just two examples of Interactivity API in WordPress today. Another kind of flagship when the Interactivity API was announced is this, yeah, okay, it's good. The wpmovies.dev, this is a great example, and there's a code-based link at the bottom here where they've been consistently updating the code because as the Interactivity API matures, there's a lot of changes. So they've been pretty consistent about updating the code base for this to pull in the latest changes. But this just shows kind of a seamless, often called single page application spa-like experience where a user can go to the site, click through different movies, see different details on each movie, click a like, perhaps watch a movie as they continue to browse. And this experience is just like the liking and the video playing in the background can continuously just follow the user around. So that's kind of the idea of these experiences with the Interactivity API of what you can do. Yeah, this one got a little. The Interactivity API it's been almost, I think, 2 years when it was first kind of proposed as probably a make post, but different, probably different artifacts exist on the proposal, but it's not something that just kind of came out of nowhere. It's been being explored, tinkered, and proposed and even iterated on. And then in 6.5, which came out, I think, early April, was the first public release. So the interactivity API was there, but it wasn't really publicly like hookable, consumable, usable. But with 6.5 now, it's, they're encouraging developers to use it, lean into it. And that's when the documentation really kind of came out alongside to help developers. But this just gives a general roadmap, and even there are some links here at the bottom for where it's being projected for 6.6, which is coming out, July, I think, any of the new features that they're proposing for that. So some of the ideas of this is definitely one of the things that's being worked on is the full page client-side navigation. The idea that you can have the WP Movies experience, which you kind of sort of can right now with the Interactivity API, and you just have to do some little workarounds, but to enable that to be a better experience and easier for engineers to pull that in. So that's definitely one of the areas that's being explored for, I think, 6.6. I don't know if it will all make it in then, but maybe beyond. What do we need the Interactivity API for? This is a common question that comes up. Why can't I just use React? Why can't I use Vue or HTMX or whatever the latest framework or library that came out? I think this is the biggest kind of, for me, the success of kind of having this API is, if you can see this very small chart, but on the left side is without the API, and then the colored side with it's green and blue are all these boxes on the right side. These are all the areas that are kind of offered when you lean into the API. You can certainly use all these other frameworks like Alpine, and you'll just have to jump through a lot more hoops and do a lot of more setup, and the onerous will be, on the developer themselves. But with this API, you get you already have the code pulled in for you, so there's already less JavaScript that's going to be shipped, and it's always going to be backwards compatible, which is always a beautiful thing with WordPress. It's one of the beauties of just WordPress. There's always going to be considerations to make everything work for all the previous versions of WordPress, and that is kind of hard to maintain as a developer if you're kind of rolling your own system. So these are kind of just some of the benefits that you get when you lean into the API. This is kind of where we'll start to peek at kind of more and more code, just to let folks know. Where you start is, there's some links here. There's a really good quick start guide. It's on developerwordpress.org. There's a whole handbook, and it'll actually step you through, if you're familiar, you have to have some requirements of being familiar with Node, and just recommended to have a local environment set up to tinker with, but it'll walk you through. There's a npx command that allows you to spin up a block, and it pulls in the interactivity template, so it kind of scaffolds everything for you, and you can even, after you run the commands, just insert your new block, and you'll kind of see a very basic interaction of clicking something and what it does, and then you can start exploring from there. So your requirements: code editor, Node.js background, and a local environment are ideal. Kind of just touched on this. This is the command for the create block package, and then the last flag there, template, and then if you pass this in, it'll create a interactivity integrated block for you.
Is it any different, create block for any other block? You're just doing the same thing you do for any block, right?
Yeah, if you're talking about the create block package, have you used the create block package before?
I mean, there's not a different one for an interactivity API. Right?
Well, that's what that flag was, yeah.
Okay, sorry.
It's the same command, so the create block package, which is linked here. That, I mean, just for folks, that's a pretty common package if you want to create a simple block and start customizing it. That's a really great place to start. And you can just run it as is and leave off the last, flag of template. But there are these things known as templates, which will kind of like scaffold it even further to set. Yeah. And I'll step through the steps of what it's kind of doing when you use that template. But no, please ask questions throughout. Don't hesitate, for sure. This kind of touches on the parts, like if you had an existing block that you wanted to try to start integrating the Interactivity API with. These are kind of some of the steps, and this is kind of what that template of create block does. In your block.json file, you need to add a definition for interactivity true, and then this newer view script modules, because the interactivity API relies on JavaScript modules, which is a newer system in WordPress, but I mean, not in JavaScript, but so this new entry allows you to point to the file, which you will write kind of your store information, which I'll get into in a little bit. So kind of those two pieces of having that file and the view script module. And then usually in your block, you would have a render.php. And by putting this new directive, data WP interactive, and then your namespace, you're kind of saying anything in this island of code, everything inside of it will be interactive. This is where we just kind of step through the pieces that make up the API. Directives are one of the like 2 or 3 pieces that really tie it together. We just kind of touched on one, which is the critical entry of WP Interactive, where it says everything inside here is going to be part of our interactive block. But a lot of these data attributes, like you'll see a common pattern, data -WP, and then it's usually followed by the directive's purpose, like bind, aria expanded, and then there's a lot of on action handlers. So on click, on document, on window, on key press, I think, down, lots of others listed here. I know, well, actually I'll touch on that a little bit, but these are a list of the current directives, and I flag these 2 because these are kind of the 2 that you'll definitely kind of use the most, and well, interactive is the one that you kind of need as a requirement. So here is where, again, we're declaring our block, and we're passing a namespace of my plugin on this line here. And then you can start passing in objects of information. So context, WP context was the other one that was flagged. That is setting up like a local, your local state. So you can have global state, which you could share between 2 blocks. So you could have a block that shares information with another block elsewhere, obviously usually on the same page. Yeah, only on the same page. But if you want to have localized state, then you could reach for WP context. So it just kind of stays to that block only.
Do you pass in variables or make it static like that? My color red would be like a default, and then you can change it.
Yes, that's kind of a default, and you can also use server-side code, which I'll touch on in a little bit, to declare that that context and pass that through. But yeah, that's just kind of setting a default state for it. Just touched on WP context, local state. And oh yes, and nesting as well. So with the WP context, your nesting of state, like you can have multiple uses. So we're referencing foo here, context foo, context foo, context foo, and they're all being merged so that the at the bottom here, because it's cascading down, the data will be merged eventually in the context there. So you kind of have multiple instances. The store is usually, this is probably a terrible explanation, but I always like to think of the store as kind of like a database for JavaScript, but that's probably a terrible paradigm. But the store is mostly what you'll manipulate in your view.js file, and that is where you're going to kind of pull in your actions and side effects and all interact with your state. The elements of the store, global state, context, and actions, side effects, and then derived state. State, I kind of already touched on the idea of global versus local, context state. Yeah, you can share data between two blocks. I'm trying to think of other purposes when there is the idea of private stores as well, which is not necessarily meaning private as in there's some kind of permissions tied to it, like user role or user permissions, not in that aspect, but more of a, if you want to have a global store but only have it, kind of lock it down to a private store, then you don't have to share all that data out. And there is, let's see, let me expand some of these. So here is where, in this bottom view.js example, matches up with the above, which you would have in your render. But this is where you would, again, we don't have it. It was on the previous screen, but we had the My plugin, which is your namespace, and that's what you're referencing and pulling your information from the store. And then you can start, like, again, here is some default, like, state that we're setting, some text, hello universe. So you could set it up there, and then it merges. That data will merge with that up there. And then you can start pulling in some actions. So again, we're using text. So we're just passing like a string to update the some text. Clever name.
What is this like in relation to? Sorry for some questions.
No.
What is this in relation to like Redux?
I'm not familiar with Redux, so yeah, I can't speak to that.
I think it does the same thing, and it's more simple.
Well, yeah, I should have clarified early. So the Interactivity API uses Preact. So I don't know that there's an equivalent, but maybe that is the equivalent is Redux. But yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not familiar with Redux, so I can't speak to it. Sure. Actions, these are often your click handlers and on document handlers. So in this example, I think it's easier to see. This looks actually, this looks like the same example. It is. Actions. Maybe I didn't update that one. I apologize. We'll definitely touch on those in a little bit. But one thing to call out with actions is, and there's been work actually in the recent weeks that isn't part of the core, but will be part of the next release. But asynchronous versus like synchronous code. So a lot of times when you're running lots of JavaScript and this impacts the Interactivity API, and it's kind of a lot of the contributions towards this package are to benefit all developers, so they, won't shoot yourself in the foot, basically. But so a lot of times when you're running a lot of synchronous actions, like when the page loads and maybe you have 5 different like buttons maybe that all have something you kind of want to trigger an action for with JavaScript, they could all kind of like tie up the main thread. So if a user if you've ever experienced where you go onto a site and it's just kind of janky and you're like trying to click on a button, it's not doing anything. And once the page finally loads, then you can click and you're like, oh, okay, why did I have to wait? They introduced a new attribute, so it's kind of using the same idea of data WP on, but they appended async, so you can kind of declare which pieces you want to run asynchronously, so it won't kind of block the main thread and cause because eventually those could pile up and cause more performance issues. So they're trying to set folks up to empower them to not create those side effects and performance degrades. Side effects, let's see. Side effects, these are trying to remember. This is more of I always forget with derived state. This is still something I'm trying to wrap my head around, and I've actually asked the contributors twice, and I feel bad because I have a hard time understanding derived state, and if anybody can actually explain it to me, I'd really appreciate it. But I'm gonna actually skip over this one because derived state is still a confusion for me. Accessing data from your store. So when you have all your code hooked up in the render.php, then you can pull in stuff like here. We're taking, we didn't have the, so the store, that's where you can declare the stuff in the context of the markup, like in render.php, but there's also a server-side functions, which we'll touch on in a little bit, that you can also declare state. And that information is immediately available in your store. So this is just kind of like a simple example of how you can actually we're declaring state within our store and the client side here, but so we're just grabbing a value, and then later on you can take the actions and you can pull by declaring state.someValue. You can pull that from the state store. So my terrible reference of store as being a JavaScript database, not really, I guess, but that's kind of it's always with JavaScript. It's all objects. It's all object oriented, and you're pulling data out of objects. So that's kind of, if you look at an object as the equivalent as a database, kind of a very plain database. The store of setting store in your view.js, you can, so we have actions, callbacks, and the state that are usually available. And so here we're using a callback, and let's see, get context. Oh, that's just a simple Boolean toggle. So we're just triggering, like in the render.php, this would be kind of like a toggle example if you were clicking an action of a button and wanted to toggle something, a Boolean value. This is just logging what that value is, and then the action is doing the actual toggling. And this is the server-side store setting that. So you can use this PHP function, because it's server-side, to declare state as well. So you don't even necessarily have to put this in your render.php. You could put this in like a plugin file or something, but this will initialize some global state that you can reference, and you could reference potentially in multiple blocks. So this actually, I think, example is kind of from the WP movies. So, several components in that site all reference, what movie is being clicked on, so they can pull in, actors and all sorts of different information. So this would be one way of doing it on the server side, which is kind of handy to have for like a fallback, so that, with a lot of these things, I guess you don't really progressively enhanced these days because the assumption is that JavaScript is always available, but it's always good to have these fallback methods of to being able to declare it in PHP. These are two handy helpers that come with the store when you're working in the view.js. You can use get context and get element, and these are, I think, just abstractions of like getters. So yeah, that's just, you can easily access the context that you set, whether you're setting it in your render.php or your the view.js. And then the get element would be tied to like whatever directive you have. Like if it's tagged on an H2, then the get element would reference that. It would just spit out the H2 information for you. And this just kind of steps into kind of what I was just explaining, get context. Again, yeah, this is like a toggle Boolean again. So we're passing a namespace. We're passing in some localized state is open false to just kind of set a default Boolean value. And then we're just watching for a click to toggle true or false. And then in our view.js, we're just logging it to the console. And get element, again, that would reference the item that has the directive associated with it. We touched on the one server-side function that you can use, but there's actually a few others, and I think there's probably maybe another one or two that might be introduced in upcoming versions. But again, these allow server-side, allow you to decide or declare stuff on the server side, so that yeah, it's just another abstraction. So if you don't want to necessarily have to do client side state initialization, these are some other handy ones. But actually this one in particular, the process directives, is kind of tied to the HTML API, which is what the Interactivity API relies on to. So when you pass those directives, it's basically processing your markup and turning those directives into, you know, associating with the client or the server client side information. So that's what the process directives. So you can actually, if you didn't perhaps want to use a render.php and you already had an existing block, you could pass your markup through the process directives and associate your state with that way. And then the WP data, WP context is just kind of a helper to parse like an object that you might pass through as JSON in your block. There's tons of great resources out there. This developer hours, or no, sorry, which one? Oh yes, the one at the top, by priority. That is a really great tutorial that steps you through how to create a block, and you'll end up creating like a donation calculator, and that's on the developer.make blog, and that's a really good piece that steps you through all the steps to kind of get spun up here. There's several YouTube videos. Ryan Welcher, I think he's developer advocate. Hopefully that's his title at Sponsored Automatic. He does live streams, and he's done a lot of knowledge sharing around creating interactivity blocks. So there's some videos up there, and I think he's been really lately doing a lot of that. So his next stream I would highly recommend catching. Some more existing examples that have kind of come out from the community. Ryan Welcher again. He just recently did a to-do list, the good old classic to-do list interpretation. There's a slider, and then I listed here the core blocks that already have some of the interactivity. Pew Research, what's his name, Courtney? Seth Rubenstein. Yeah, they have done full-on, fully leaned into using the Interactivity API, and I think he has a post coming out on just how they did it. but a lot of their code base is available from this link PRC block library. I have a feedback form that I created. That's what this little screencast is showing. That's on GitHub as well. That's just the idea of you can put a feedback form at the end of a post and say, user clicks, like it, hate it, love it, don't like it, and you can leave a comment, and it just sends it to the WordPress admin email address. And then there's a GitHub discussions area where folks have been listing stuff that they create, and probably everything that's on here is in there. So, and more, and stuff as it comes out from the community gets logged in there typically. That's all I have, and just this presentation was created with the Bounds theme and actually uses the Interactivity API. Again, that's why I've referenced Ryan. A huge shout out to Ryan Welcher, because his slider, like his explorations with the slider, I've definitely, taken a lot of the pieces from that and created, this slider presentation. But yeah, this is still on GitHub. I haven't pushed it up to the repo yet, because there is certainly a lot of accessibility audit that I would like to do to make sure that it has a long ways to go. But I'm always looking for code contributions if anybody wants to help me explore and build it some more. And yeah, I'm open to questions, and I'll be around the rest of the day if anybody wants to build a block or try building a block or tried it before and just had a headache afterward. Hopefully I can save you a step or two. And any questions?
Yeah, you're not doing much on the back end with these, right? Like all this, like Vue.js and render.php are all for the viewer, the front end. And the Interactivity API does not do a hell of a lot with the developer experience, like what you see in the WPM. Is that true?
Correct. Yes, right now. I think I just saw something that's being worked on for, it's a matter, yeah. It's not in WP admin at the moment. Yes, right. Correct.
So this is front end stuff and no real difference to the. So I'm trying to think, like, if I have a really complicated stuff on the back end, it really, it's completely separate.
You can still, the feedback block, this is, you can still pass, in your render.php, you can still use good old, this is using, post ID and passing it down. So when the user submits their feedback, it's passing that post ID along, as well as some other, server logic and stuff. So you can still, do a lot with all the WordPress, hooks and stuff.
For sure. You know what I mean? Like how they do the WPM, a completely different experience from,
Yeah. It's not available in the WP admin yet.
Thank you.
Good question, yeah. Yep.
What does composability look like in two forms? One, I'm looking at your block here, and I'm wondering if I were to, let's say, want to make a bigger, let's say, slide talk feedback thing, and I wanted to use the work that you've done for the smiley faces and selecting things. Is there a way in my block's JavaScript that I can access your block's JavaScript?
Yes and no. Yes, that's kind of what the store is. So if depends on how I built this, if this was usually, when you build some, I set out to build this very specific
Sure,
block.
in an example in which you were
but you
wanting
can
to
have
build
multiple
something that was
blocks
reusable.
communicating with each other, yes.
Gotcha,
So,
and that can be done out, because I noticed it seemed like a lot of the examples were all grouped by your namespace, but that's not a real boundary if I wanted to.
No. And the namespace is the critical part that you would say global state, use your namespace, and then in another block you could say, reference that namespace and pull in the state and use the pieces from the state that you want in that other block. But yeah, the WP Movies GitHub repo is they have a good example in there of how, especially the likes, so when you click the heart, the movie down below that you're on that page, it's also updating like a heart elsewhere, so it's kind of showing how that works. But that's a good example. Sure.
What parts are you hoping will get further attention with the Interactivity API in upcoming releases? Are there any areas that you've seen yet that are being developed further?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm seeing, I mean, to be honest, like the stuff that I'm seeing blows my mind. Like just the recent, yeah, stuff that's been merged that isn't publicly available yet, but in the upcoming releases will be. But I know like, what's his name? Weston Reuter, I think he's a Google sponsored contributor. He's been doing some really great, like the idea of appending async to some of the directives. They're doing a really good job looking at for performance impact, because while done right, like none of this should have, like it should just be a speedier experience in theory. But if folks could do some things terribly wrong and make really poorly degraded experiences that are just frustrating. So I think they're trying to kind of set some guardrails and help set folks up and developers up for to be successful and not have like really slow pages and frustrated users, because nobody wants that.
And this may be totally obvious, but the JavaScript itself, it's not like server side evaluating the directives that I'm doing, or is it like if I said this bit of HTML should only be visible if it's toggled on, when the page, that isn't being evaluated on the server, right? It's still being evaluated in JavaScript on the front end?
I think it would help to
Like you had the
focus on
toggle
an
example, I
Okay.
think, of like an is open and is closed.
Right.
And if I had it closed by default,
Okay.
when the page loads, that's when that evaluation is actually happening, right? It's not like I know we're putting a lot of these directives in PHP and HTML, but that's not actually being processed in PHP and HTML. It's still being processed in JavaScript on the front end.
Well, it's a little bit of both, really. Yeah. So that's, I think, why like even, maybe it'd be easier to go back, but this was, yeah. So this is a good example. So you could, in your render.php, this is server side, right? You can set some default parameters. So I liked it, I mean, coming from a front end experience, like the idea of progressively enhancing and always assuming, I mean, I used to always say, JavaScript, you got to design because JavaScript might be blocked and nothing's there. So that's typically how I build, to have some default, like, set whether it should be hidden for the best or shown, if somebody did not have JavaScript, if you want a button to be shown no matter what, then set that default state on the server. And then you can manipulate that further along with client-side stuff. So once it's loaded, you could hide it.
So it would be a choice that I make as a developer when I'm writing my render.php to render the HTML in such a way that it matches what I would want to on initial page load.
Yep. Yes. Yep. And there is a lot of, I mean, a lot of accessibility considerations there, is make sure the stuff that you want for everybody to always be there, and just kind of set yourself up for that. And then hope that everybody's got JavaScript and has no problem and it's all loaded. And
Well, wouldn't that be the same as just setting defaults in a programmatic way using JavaScript and like having JavaScript populate this element with what you want as a default, right? Is basically what those directives are doing.
Well, the idea, like here, is that you'll have, this is PHP, so if you set movie name here, and then further down in your file you say, echo, well, actually you wouldn't use echo, but you would, it would still evaluate this server side code and output it in the HTML, even if like JavaScript was like disabled.
Right. Okay. Got it.
So
It's a safer way to do it.
yeah.
Is that a div? What is WP in interactivity state? Is that like like UI element?
What's that?
Is that like a div or a UI element?
This here? That's just like a helper function that you can put anywhere. I mean, I've used it a few times in the render.php, but you could put it like in your plugin, and just as long as if you're referencing like favorite movies, which is the namespace, then you could reference that in multiple blocks, because that's setting up the state.
So in your example where you set like the background, you had like a data WP style. So that would be a case where when the page loads, if JS wasn't available, it wouldn't have that background style applied, or would PHP see that there was a background style directive in CSS?
Yeah, I'm quite sure in that instance it would still it still parses, because the HTML API is being used to kind of associate those directives, so it's still parsing through those directives, so the style would still be output regardless of JavaScript being enabled or disabled.
So it would see that, hey, we declared this state with our PHP function, we're rendering our block, we come across this directive that sets the style background color to some property that exists in our store, and then does all that computation and translates it so that it's rendered on the front end as a problem.
Isn't that the benefit of doing it in PHP? So you're connecting against JavaScript, we can say it.
Yeah, that's what. Yeah, I think he's hinting at. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, do as much as you can with the server logic to kind of set yourself up with some sane defaults, and then sprinkle the magic of JavaScript. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah, sorry, getting my head around it. It's so much easier to do it that way. So, because a lot of times you'll take JavaScript and you'll put in a lot of defaults using, get element by ID, whatever. But to do it this way, it's a lot safer.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these, like even with blocks, I tend to do them. I mean, I'll go to CodePen and do the markup first, and then, then the CSS to make it look pretty good, and then sprinkle in the JavaScript later, so that abstraction. But then you also have PHP. You got good old WordPress logic too. So I probably make it more harder on myself, but I just like to break things apart like that. Really good question.
Great stuff, yeah.
So it's interesting because if you're building a block from scratch, obviously some of these things you just do with React is as easy, but with the WordPress functions, it's integrated with WordPress, so that helps. I was curious, I mean, this whole thing kind of slid through my development as well, so it's interesting to kind of get into it. If you're doing a block with ACF, for instance, you're mostly using PHP, and now you don't have that kind of Java, React background and all that in the block. Is it still possible to kind of use this stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I forgot to link to it, and I apologize. But I created a ACF, because at WP Engine, we own ACF, but I created essentially like that movie, I created that with ACF blocks. And that's on my GitHub profile. I can share the link with you afterward, but I should have put that in there as an example, but I think I did that after the last time I created this presentation. So, but yeah, there's different ways. ACF blocks handle a few different things differently, but you can do it for sure. And pulling in post meta is getting a little easier each release, but still a ways to go. Any other questions? Oh, okay. Yeah.
So I guess this kind of has like some WP Engine stuff. Like, do you all foresee, because you have like the full like headless WordPress setup where you're like completely doing JavaScript front end and all that kind of stuff. Like,
Yeah.
do you see the Interactivity API serving similar use cases to that like headless thing, or do you still think like I wouldn't use the Interactivity API to build a fully STA-ish JavaScript website the same way that I would use like the headless stuff or.
I think that, I mean, most of the team I work with, we know that there's a billion ways to do WordPress. There's so many ways to do WordPress. The headless side of things, I don't explore as much these days. But I think I mean, I think most folks are, if they don't know yet, when they start to explore headless, they realize where the benefits, when do I go headless? Or why should I never go headless? Because for these XYZ reasons. So I think that is more of a start there. Like, do you need headless, and would you use it for project X based on, the features that you're trying to accomplish? And then the consideration of whether you did, you're like, oh yeah, I'm gonna do headless WordPress. You could certainly, I don't know that I've seen an example lately, but I'm sure you can. You can pull in the Interactivity API package itself and use, stuff like that. But it's probably at that point, it's like, are you more comfortable writing in, pure React or pure Vue or whatever you're using for your front end, than whether you really wanted to lean into that API and learn it, or if you're just more comfortable doing it in React, then that's probably more of a question at that point.
That actually tied into my earlier question, because I was asking about like the front end, back end. For headless, you really have there's not much use for this, right?
Well, I mean, I wonder, one of the problems in a headless context is you have all these cool Gutenberg blocks, and then how you translate it into a headless environment becomes less clear. But if your Gutenberg blocks have an Interactivity API component, and then you're able to inform the Interactivity API into your headless build, you can make maybe a more compelling headless website, because you can get the fuller benefit of Gutenberg blocks. You're not re-rendering HTML and re-adding interactivity.
Yeah, I think there's certainly room for exploration there, and whether there's benefit, I'm sure there's challenges and benefits, and
I have some things I would just say about the headless and the Gutenberg stuff. I'd be curious to know, from your experience or others too. But with the Gutenberg stuff and going full headless, it does throw Gutenberg out the window to a certain extent, because of how Gutenberg stores everything in the database. And then when you go full headless, you're working outside of WordPress, and you have to use GraphQL, make your queries separately, and it's a very different process. I actually use WP Engine's Atlas product at work, so it's very, very different. So I was just kind of curious, and curious also if anybody else has experience.
How does
with it.
PHP even work on headless? Because
It doesn't work at all. Yeah, because I mean, at that point, you're managing two separate code bases, not so much two separate sites, but it's like you have one WordPress, the PHP side, then you have everything else written in JavaScript, Next, GraphQL, and you literally have to,
populate data.
Yeah, exactly. And then you've got to use GraphQL to make all your queries, and it's a whole different process. Yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, it's a whole different kind of mind frame of taking and parsing the content from WordPress in a headless world. There are solutions like the Faust framework is one, there's different ways of doing it, and but even so, once it's in React, yes, you could pull in the Interactivity API package, but at that point you're probably working more in React or something, then it might not be beneficial. But as it matures, it might be.
Then you have to send up to GraphQL and back into React, and it would be such a really messy.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a bunch of different languages for sure. I think we're at time. Thank you, everybody. Great questions. Thanks for coming.